Should never, ever. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. My cell phone just reminded me to ask you all to please turn your cell phones off, or at least to silence, if you don't mind. Sometimes they interfere with the frequency of the microphone. Welcome, everybody. My name's Jennifer Golden. I'm the Managing Director of the International Institute for Strategic Studies here in Washington. It's my honor to chair this event today, the launch of Asia's Latent Nuclear Powers, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, a new Adelphi book that's authored by our very own Mark Fitzpatrick. Put a plug in for the book. If you're interested in buying one, you can do that today, right outside after the event. I might even ask Mark to stick around and sign it.
Absolutely.
And you can also order it on our website. I think a lot of you all here know our speakers already personally, and I won't spend very long on their bios because I believe you have them in front of you on a sheet of paper. But very briefly, Mark Fitzpatrick is the Executive Director of IISS Americas here in Washington. He's also the Director of the Institute's Non-Proliferation Nuclear Policy Program. In addition to Asia's latent nuclear powers, he's written and edited books about nuclear issues in North Korea, Iran, and Pakistan. Mark came to the Institute after a distinguished 26-year career in the Department of State, where among many other things, he was responsible for policies to address proliferation challenges posed by Iran, North Korea, Libya, Iraq, and other regions of concern. Ambassador Robert Gallucci is the former Ambassador at Large and Special Envoy for the U.S. Department of State, where he dealt with threats posed by the proliferation of ballistic missiles and weapons of mass destruction. He was the chief U.S. negotiator during the North Korean nuclear crisis of 1994. Bob served as Assistant Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs, Deputy Executive Chairman of UNSCOM. He was also the Dean of Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, President of the MacArthur Foundation, and many, many other roles. The format for today, I'm going to ask Mark to make some introductory remarks about the book for 10 or 15 minutes or so, and then we're going to ask Bob to respond, provide some critique and context based on your experiences in the region. I want to remind everybody that today's event is on the record and we're being webcast live. So
Thanks very much, Jennifer. Thank you all for coming. Thank you very much, Bob. It's an honor to have a former mentor here joining me on the panel. As Jennifer mentioned, most of my career the last 20 years has been focused on outlier states, the so-called rogue states in North Korea, Iran, other countries that have departed from international norms and threatened a non-proliferation regime. But I came to realize that if there are other departures from the non-proliferation treaty, from the norms, it may well be insiders, America's friends, prompted by threats that they face. And 3 of them are in Northeast Asia among America's partners. If anybody has to leave early, I'll tell you the bottom line. I don't think they're going to go nuclear.
We're done here, folks.
The key is the credibility of U.S. deterrence. And I think that's going to remain strong. But right at the end, I'll tell you one niggling concern I have that's getting greater. Among the 3 democracies that this book deals with, the one of most concern in terms of maybe going nuclear is South Korea. It's not because the government of South Korea is in any way not attached to its non-proliferation commitments. They're very firm about it. But it's because the people of South Korea don't have the same degree of attachment to the non-proliferation norm. It's witnessed in the polling that consistently shows more than half of the South Korean population, when asked, say, yes, we should have nuclear weapons because the North has them. And it's witnessed also in the greater number of editorials and comments by otherwise responsible South Korean politicians and journalists, columnists, who are advocating South Korea leaving the NPT. They say this very casually. That worries me. Now, under political science realism theory, all 3 of these democracies would be nuclear armed by now because they all face nuclear armed adversaries. But they haven't gone nuclear over the years, mainly because they could rely on the United States for ultimate security. And in the case of two of them, South Korea and Taiwan, there was an American successful diplomatic and intelligence effort that stopped them when they were going down the path of nuclear weapons. Latent, in the title of the book, latent means to have capabilities that could be put to nuclear weapons purposes if a decision were made to go down that route. In Japan's case, it goes beyond latency, just having the capabilities, to what I would call quasi-hedging. Hedging being latency with intent. There's enough evidence that over the years, statements by Japanese politicians and senior leaders, that one of the reasons for their sensitive nuclear technologies is to have a potential option in the future in the case of a rainy day. Now, it's quasi because their main purpose is economic, energy security. And it's also, sometimes these statements by Japanese politicians over the years, they were designed for diplomatic leverage to remind the United States that they did have this potential, and it always encouraged the United States to strengthen the deterrence. South Korea wants the same capabilities that Japan has. And now that Iran has. For South Korea, it's again mainly for economic reasons, for political reasons, for reasons of fairness, as I say, because Japan has the technologies. But in South Korea's case, there's also a hedging rationale for why they want pyroprocessing, a form of reprocessing. I understand the concern for fairness in South Korea's case. I think they forget that in some ways they are ahead of Japan, that they've been allowed capabilities that Japan has not. In terms of missiles, South Korea has more sophisticated missiles. They have ground-launched missiles that Japan doesn't have. Japan has the reprocessing. Why? Because they started down the road before America changed its policy in 1976. And Carter tried to hold the line, but was persuaded to allow limited, and then Reagan allowed unlimited. And some South Koreans say, well, what if a Reagan-like figure were elected president? Would he allow South Korea unlimited reprocessing? I don't think they would. Many in our field of nonproliferation would call the expansion of these sensitive nuclear technologies, plutonium reprocessing and uranium enrichment, as perhaps the greatest proliferation threat today. As some say, nuclear latency is the new nuclear proliferation. Japan has made many contributions to the global nonproliferation regime. They could make an even greater one if they were to stop reprocessing and not go ahead with Rokusho. I think they're going to go ahead with Rokusho. At least they're not going to not go ahead with Rokusho. They might just keep kicking the can down the road. It's been delayed 22 times, probably be delayed 10 more times. Meanwhile, the United States really needs to hold the line on discouraging any other country from going down the road of these sensitive nuclear technologies. In the case of South Korea, when the current nuclear cooperation agreement is up for renewal in 5 years, I think holding the line will be important. In the case of Saudi Arabia, which talks about wanting enrichment because Iran has it, I think every member of the nuclear suppliers group needs to hold the line and not sell technologies that would be for nuclear hedging or nuclear weapons purpose. I wrote this book not knowing the recent developments that occurred that make it more timely. Obviously, North Korea's recent nuclear test, their recent missile test, that has really, I think, affected attitudes in South Korea. Some of my South Korean friends call it a sea change in attitudes that makes them want to discuss more their own prospects for going down a nuclear weapons option and to find every other conceivable means of trying to create leverage with North Korea. The other new development of note is in Taiwan. Now, in Taiwan, there's been, I could find no advocacy in the public realm for a nuclear weapons option in the last 10 years. The last time was an op-ed in the Taipei Times in 2004. They don't talk about a nuclear weapons option today, although privately I talked with several Taiwanese who wish that America hadn't stopped them back in the day. But what's changed in Taipei is the dynamics in the cross-strait relations with the coming to power of the Democratic Progressive Party taking office in May. Taiwan faces an existential threat unlike, I think, any other government in the world. And its weakness in compared to the Chinese mainland, it grows weaker every day in terms of defense spending and defense capabilities. Before Taiwan's election, Xi Jinping warned the Taiwanese about a deterioration in cross-strait relations if the winners don't accept the so-called 1992 consensus that there is but one China. And the DPP, Tsai Ing-wen doesn't agree with that formula. So I think it's fair to say Taiwan's security in the future is clouded. That doesn't mean they're going to go down the nuclear weapons route. In fact, Taiwan is moving away from all things nuclear. Soon they will have no nuclear power plants at all if plans continue. And I think this will actually remove the latency in Taiwan's case. In Japan's case, going back to it, despite the quasi-hedging strategy, the anti-nuclear norm is the popular aversion to nuclear weapons remains very powerful. Some people looking at the other changes that Japan has made in its defense policy, Prime Minister Abe's desire to make Japan a more normal country in terms of its defense, leads some in South Korea and China and elsewhere to think that, okay, the next step is going to be nuclear weapons pursuit. Japan's constitution, the peace constitution, doesn't have to be changed for that purpose. There have been legal decisions that say that actually a small defensive nuclear capability wouldn't violate the constitution. But I just don't see Japan going down that route because of the popular aversion and because they still have a better security option in the partnership with the United States. So to be normal for Japan will continue to be non-nuclear because most countries in the world, to be normal means non-nuclear. But Japan is worried about the increasing potential military threat from China. It's not just China's nuclear modernization, it's probably even more so China's growing anti-access area denial capabilities, which the Japanese worry could preclude America from coming quickly to Japan's defense. The idea is that if there is, in the strategic realm, the nuclear realm that is, mutual assured destruction, or let's say mutual vulnerability between China and the United States, then underneath that mutual vulnerability, if China had a conventional superiority, it would affect America's ability to come to the defense of Japan. That's the concern that you hear among many Japanese experts. And it doesn't mean that they're going to go nuclear. It means that America has to continue what it has been doing to have a seamless defense arrangements with Japan to preclude any of the kind of gray area incursions that they worry about from China. But it is conceivable that this Chinese threat could lead Japan down the road of thinking again someday about nuclear weapons. More conceivable, though, the kind of what could really spark Japan, it's not something that it's immediately obvious, but a unified Korean peninsula is what many Japanese will talk about in moments of privacy. If a unified Korea combined North Korea's nuclear weapons with South Korea's economic and industrial might, that would create a threat to Japan. But fortunately, every time South Korean president talks about a unified Korea, it's a non-nuclear unified Korea, that they would reject nuclear weapons, and it's good that they keep saying that. It will be important if North Korea collapses for the United States and its partners in South Korea to ensure that all of North Korea's fissile material is removed or destroyed, all the facilities destroyed. There's a concern that some of it would remain and who would grab it. So finally, in conclusion, just to repeat, so nobody had to leave actually, so I didn't have to say it in the beginning, but I don't think these countries are going to go nuclear. But the credibility of America's deterrence is the key. And even Taiwan, which doesn't have a formal defense alliance relationship with the United States, has a de facto sense that America will be there for them. And as long as that sense remains, and it's a perception that's more important even than the actual ability of the United States, because I think there's no doubting the ability. The credibility, I think, has been strengthened in recent years by the deterrence dialogues that the United States has established, both with Japan and South Korea, that brings both countries in a quasi-NATO relationship. They don't have nuclear sharing, but they see the goods. They go to the Strategic Air Command. They talk about what would trigger nuclear signaling and so forth. That all strengthens the relationship, and it's one of the reasons why the alliances between the United States and Japan, the United States and South Korea are probably stronger than ever. You see this in public opinion polls, and it's also evident when you talk to officials. But here's the niggling concern, and I'm sure you all know what I'm about to say. If Donald Trump continues to undermine the credibility of the American deterrence, it could be the biggest trigger for our friends in Northeast Asia to think that they can't rely upon the United States anymore. And anybody who's been in Northeast Asia, I'm sure, has heard this, and I've heard it. I think that he will not do what he says in the campaign trail. Many new presidents don't, but I just don't think he'll be the new president when people realize the dangers, and this is one of the dangers that it would spark.
On that happy note,
Is this a Stop Trump rally? I didn't get that. So first, thank you, Mark, for inviting me here. Thank you all for coming. This does, as I look around the room, look a little bit like a reunion, so and that's fun. So first thing I want to say is that it's a good book. I would be surprised if everybody here had read it. I would like to take a true-false test on it. But it's a good book and it's worth reading. You have one course adoption. I'll use it in my course at Georgetown. I want to make some points, 14, like Woodrow Wilson, and they go to implications of what Mark said. Plus, I want to help him out a little here because he needs a little headline here. It's a little bad news. It's the fragility of your, what I would agree with, correct prediction that this is not going to happen. But what's the sensitivity here? Where are the sensitivities? What kind of circumstances could cause the world to change in a dramatic way, beginning with that part of the world? The first thing that occurred to me was the word latency, and I wondered where else, you don't have to answer this right now, but where else you'd apply the term. Suppose I said, okay, who are the other latent powers around, and what is latency composed of? So I was wondering, is Italy a latent nuclear weapon state? It certainly has capability, or had capability, knows how to reprocess, has delivery systems. And then what about Belgium? Well, they had a reprocessing facility. What about the Netherlands? They had an enrichment facility. Does it have to be a country that feels a threat? And of course, those countries did feel a threat were it not for, sorta, the extended deterrence of NATO. So I think the latency word needs just a little more attention. Second, the whole book is a wonderful treatment of and invites you in to think about extended deterrence, and the importance of extended deterrence, and its, pardon me, but the fragility of extended deterrence. There's an article done by Linton Brooks in which he says, think about extended deterrence. It's got having three pieces: deterrence, which is aimed at the party you wish to deter; assurance, which is aimed at your allies, and you wish to persuade them that they can trust you, the credibility of your deterrent; and then there's reassurance, which is to tell the first target of deterrence that this is all aimed at retaliation should they do something. But that is not to say it is no first use, which is one of the real difficult dilemmas that a country, as Mark points out, like Japan, which might like the United States of America to adopt a no first use policy. But then, of course, if it did, it would have certain implications for the flexibility the United States would have in a contingency in which it wished to extend deterrence and where conventional forces were inadequate. It would want to be able to fall back on the use of nuclear forces. So this gets very complicated. It's psychological, but it goes to the heart of the question of whether a country decides it can trust the U.S. offer of deterrence. Third point for me goes to the question of the extent to which this extended deterrence is one piece. In other words, when you could say Ukraine lost Crimea and the United States watched this happen, what did that mean for the U.S. security guarantee in Europe? Well, the first thing everybody wanted to point out on the American side was not in NATO, not part of guarantee. But still, psychologically, it was troubling. Certainly, it was troubling in the Baltics, and there's quite a concern there. And then, of course, the president went about the world because there isn't a sense in which deterrence is one piece. And if America fails to show its credibility in one place, even when there is no de jure commitment to extend the deterrence, it makes people nervous. And clearly it made people nervous in Asia, in Northeast Asia, in Japan, and in the Republic of Korea. That is something to think about whenever there is a confrontation and you're trying to figure out what the stakes are. But I'm sure Donald Trump will get the subtleties all right. That's nothing to worry about here. Fourth, for me, is a question the implications of this for the sensitivities of the Republic of Korea. We just went through 123 negotiations, now they're called 123 negotiations with the Republic of Korea. And the question is, okay, so we came out of that well, from our perspective, which is without prior consent being offered to South Korea. But what would change that? Well, would the opening of the reprocessing plant in Japan change that? Would the completion of the deal between the French and the Chinese for an 800-ton reprocessing plant for commercial purposes change that? I mean, to what are the sensitivities in terms of a country deciding that they will move further along the road of their latency, or they can't afford not to, as other countries do, as the plutonium overhang in Japan increases? If Japanese nuclear weapons would drive South Korean nuclear weapons, and maybe vice versa, then what does increased plutonium overhang in Japan mean for Seoul? And I think that's worth thinking about. There's also a proposition about the implications of the latency situation in South Korea advancing to a South Korean reprocessing capability with pyroprocessing or regular Purex reprocessing, and the implications for North Korea. And the suggestion is that it might be helpful. Well, having had passing acquaintance with the North Korean issue, I would like to offer that it would not be helpful. That as if any of you were going to go off and negotiate with North Korea, and someone said, well, do you want the South Koreans to open that reprocessing plant to help you along? Say no to that. It's not a good idea. I have this point 6. If there is to be a negotiation with North Korea to switch this around, it is extremely important, if we're looking at the sensitivities here of this issue, that that negotiation have as a premise that there can at least be an outcome at the end of the process that is one in which North Korea becomes a non-nuclear weapon state. If the United States fails to have that in place, this is a safety tip, fails to have that in place, then the implications are that the negotiations would serve to legitimize North Korean nuclear weapons. Bad signal to South Korea was looking for us in a formal sense, as well as in a de facto sense, to maintain the position they do that stability does not include North Korea as a nuclear weapon state, no matter what they may write into their constitution. I hadn't known they had one, actually. One of the things that Mark mentions and goes into, there's several points where he talks about reprocessing plants, their capabilities, and he gives very high marks. He makes a distinction, I hope this is fair, you can say if it isn't, between sort of the record of the South Koreans with respect to not being latent, having a closet nuclear weapons program, and the Japanese, who are, I think you use various phrases, but they amount to squeaky clean on this subject, that the Japanese have not done anything physically. They're putting studies aside and discussion. They have not diverted material. They haven't done anything like that. Okay, but the famous muff factor, if you are an IAEA walla, you know that there is material unaccounted for problems in any large process facility, like an enrichment facility and a reprocessing facility. And Japan has, with Tokai, and will, if it opens the next one, it will have an extraordinary problem. I believe you take the 1% muff and translate that into the number of nuclear weapons, non-trivial. An 800-ton plant is not going to have a 1% muff factor. It's going to be bigger. And what we will be into in safeguards world, and anybody here who wants to correct me on this afterwards, I'd love to engage on it, is not a material balance. You're not going to get out what you put in. What you're going to do is you're going to get many nuclear weapons worth of material not out. And the Japanese will explain process loss, material unaccounted for. However, therefore, the real proposition here is that containment, physical containment and surveillance replaces material balance in terms of the way in which the IAEA fulfills its function. For those who worry about what could happen, that's not going to be satisfying, because the numbers of nuclear weapons equivalent in terms of the material unaccounted for in plutonium will be enormous each year. I would like Mark to say something about the significance of the public opinion issue. I think it is interesting that in South Korea, that public opinion favors acquisition of nuclear weapons, and it is therefore even more interesting that public opinion opposes acquisition of nuclear weapons in Japan. One could argue that South Korea needs to worry about North Korea and not much else, given its relationship with China. One could argue that Japan needs to worry about everything. It needs to worry about North Korea, it needs to worry about Japan, and if South Korea got nuclear weapons, it have to worry about South Korea too. But in Japan, while we have recognized the nuclear allergy will not serve to explain all policy of Japan with respect to matters nuclear, it seems to me to still have some resonance, and I would be interested in how important you really think that is at the end of the day. The question of whether extended deterrence for the North Koreans and or the Japanese can be undercut by North Korea is an interesting one, but seems bizarre when you compare it to the stress that should be put on the assurance that Chinese capability does. And Mark takes a fair amount of time to address this, and it's worth y'all thinking about it, that the Chinese are moving in the direction of, let us say, local area dominance. And yes, they talk about area denial, et cetera, but what it really means is they might have escalatory dominance at the conventional level in areas proximate to Chinese territory, whether it's a Taiwan contingency, where it's a Japanese island issue, whatever, or a North Korea thing gone bad. The Chinese don't need to have the force projection capability we do to cause us conventional difficulty, and of course they are targeting our comparative advantages at the conventional level. we have sort of sotto voce been saying without saying that we don't want to go there, you Chinese don't want to go there, because as you go up the ladder, then of course the assurance extends to our nuclear capability. We do not have a no first use policy, and so we would get on an escalatory ladder in which we do have dominance, unless we don't. And the question is whether, as Mark was saying before, a situation in which the United States, and it's been encouraged to do this so far, has not, assures China that we perceive them as having second strike capability, to use the language, their capability to deter us from use against them. How does that impact our capability to, with credibility, extend deterrence to Japan and Korea in a contingency, let's say a Taiwan contingency? This gets theological. I mean, it's awful, but it's also extremely important that the language of particularly an American president be exquisite and precise here, because we don't want to undercut deterrence ourselves. This is why I'm particularly happy about a Trump candidacy, because we know how careful he has been with language. So, moving on. A word which I think would be usefully introduced in a discussion of Mark's book is the word ambiguity, because the word ambiguity has been used to describe the positive way in which presidents and secretaries of state and national security advisors address these contingencies by not being explicit about what we would do. The chapter on Taiwan, which I have to confess, I read that while I was driving in on Route 66 yesterday, so it's a little sketchy for me, but the chapter on Taiwan should make you feel particularly uneasy. And it should, because there are things everybody knows, all of which cannot be true. And that's when you start getting in trouble. One thing the Chinese know is that Taiwan is part of China. They know this, as one Chinese explained to me, much like Long Island, where you grew up, is part of the United States of America. So is Taiwan to China. Got that. Appreciate bringing it home for me. And they think we know that. That's the really interesting part. We think that they know that we were serious about the assurance that while we were prepared to watch lots of things happen in the interaction between the peoples on Taiwan, not a country, and China, what we're not prepared to do is to have the status of Taiwan changed by the use of force by China. And we think they know that. It's pretty clear to me, after watching a couple of the crises we've gone through, is all those things can't be true at the same time. As a matter of fact, this was brought home to me by the ambassador of one of our allies in the region, who knows America very well, knows China very well, who said to me, while we were in the midst of this crisis, and we were moving the 7th Fleet around, the Chinese were testing their missiles, and the Taiwanese had said bad things from the Chinese perspective, and this ambassador said to me, "You Americans shouldn't bluff like this over Taiwan." I said, "I don't think we're bluffing." I said, "I don't think any American president is going to let, Hong Kong be the model for Taiwan. I don't think that's going to happen if the president wishes not to be impeached. I don't think he can pass on this. This is not Crimea." And he couldn't say that then because Crimea hadn't happened yet. This is different. And he said, "No, you'd never do anything." And he sounded much like the Chinese general who said to Chaz Freeman, you won't trade Los Angeles for Taipei. If they have this wrong, and they believe that, and I believe that if they believe that they have this wrong, this is something to really worry about. And that means that when the new president becomes the new president in Taiwan, I hope she takes great care with her talking points. That's the only thing. I'm about at the end of what I want to say here, except that you wouldn't expect to be reading Mark's book and laugh out loud, but I did. And I wanted to share that one spot with you where I laughed out loud. I did not, I mean, I've been doing this a long time, as many of you in this room have, and I still managed to learn a lot of stuff from this book, so I liked it, but this was one also I hadn't known. Apparently, and I read this, remember, on Route 66, I might have gotten this wrong, but I don't think I did. Apparently, the Chinese position in 1968 or 69, before entry into force of the NPT, the Taiwanese position,
yeah.
the Taiwanese position was that they could acquire nuclear weapons and not violate the NPT. How? Well, China had already detonated a nuclear weapon, and since they were China, see, you laughed out loud too. So, great book. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks so much.
Right.
That's great.
All right, I want to go right to questions because I know there's a lot of expertise assembled in this room. I'm going to ask, when you do have a question, raise your hand, wait for the microphone to come to you, state your name, and keep your question short. Also, there was a few things that Bob raised, Mark, that I'm sure you'll want to talk about. So maybe what we'll do is take a question or two and then see if we can address some of those through the questions. If not, then we'll take a break. Okay, we've got one right in the back there near you, Maria. Yep.
Okay. I agree with you, Mark. I don't see any move in Japan towards nuclear weapons. I mean, they could if they wanted to, but they decided a long time ago it's not where they want to put their defense resources because it's something they couldn't really use. One factor being, if you look at prevailing winds, it's not a good idea for Japan to use nukes on the Korean Peninsula. But one thing I think you are going to see, and I'd like your view on this, the Japanese are very concerned about the North Korea nuclear program and more concerned about the missile program. So I think you're not going to see any move towards nuclear weapons, but you are going to see a lot of discussion after the July election coming up in the summer about a strike capability or a counter-strike capability, a conventional capability, whether that be sea-launched cruise missiles like Tomahawk or JASSM, an air-launched stealth cruise missile. How do you think that affects the equation in South Korea if the Japanese acquire a conventional strike or counter-strike capability?
Let's take one more in the back. The woman in the...
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, and I'm very much looking forward to reading your book. Can I get it back in London so I don't have to carry it back?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. My question is really that the idea of a Northeast Asia nuclear weapon-free zone is one that's been around a long time. But I was interested that in my last visits to Japan in November of last year, it seemed to be gaining a lot more traction than I'd seen in previous times. And in fact, I was at a couple of meetings that had a number of South Koreans and Japanese academics and a few officials talking about that with more focus than I'd heard. So I'd be very, very interested in actually both of your views about whether this has any possible legs at all, and if so, what might be some of the conditions that would be required to get talks underway.
Okay. You want to start?
Okay, well, as for the latency, Mohammed Al-Berde, when he was Director General of the IEA, one time said that there were 44 countries that had a nuclear capability. And I think this is in the context of Iran. And Iran loved it when he said that because they just want to be one of those 44. I think they were the countries that had research reactors and therefore sizable enough that they could produce plutonium. So I do distinguish between latency and hedging. And it's all a matter of intent, and it's a matter of threat perceptions. And so one could become the other. That's one of the things I worry about happening in Northeast Asia. The significance of public opinion, I think, is very important in Japan still. You know, Japan has had 3 of its neighbors go nuclear in the post-war era. The Soviet Union in 1949, China in 1964, North Korea in 2006. And none of them sparked a feeling that Japan had to have its own nuclear weapons. The North Korea test did change one taboo in Japan, the taboo against discussing the issue. At least it could be open to discussion, but it didn't change the popular attitudes. One of the things that's important about this is the impact of public opinion on the scientists who would be involved in any such effort. In Japan, the scientists are among those who share this aversion to nuclear weapons. And it's one of the reasons Japan, I'm certain, could not go nuclear in any secret way, because there would be whistleblowers. And the contrast in Korea, and I'm not saying that the South Korean nuclear scientists are pro nuclear weapons, but when some of them were dabbling in enrichment and reprocessing and it got caught out, they were not penalized. They emerged as heroes for trying to give South Korea a capability. So I think those attitudes are important. And so this relates to Kevin's point about what would be the impact on South Korean attitudes if Japan were to have such strike capabilities. I think it's an issue that is very much going to be have to be discussed in the next year or so. Also, South Korea's own strike capabilities. There's a growing discussion about whether and to what extent South Korea could preempt North Korean launch if it looked like something was being readied for real. And I can understand why the Japanese also would like to have such a preemptive capability in the form of a strike. But it certainly would make the South Koreans worried. I mean, any such expansion in Japanese offensive capabilities would exacerbate South Korean concerns. So Rebecca's point about the Northeast Asia nuclear weapons free zone is one way in which some of these concerns, mutual concerns, could try to be overcome by having everybody agree we won't have nuclear weapons. And I do know that there is a growing sense among some in academic communities. I didn't talk about it much in my book because it's not on the agenda of anybody in government in any of the countries affected, because all of them would fear that it would undermine the kind of credibility of American extended deterrence. A lot of South Koreans say, well, how can America show us capabilities that show us that they're going to be there with a nuclear umbrella? They want, some of them want tactical nuclear weapons, or short of that, some other means. And I said, well, no, you don't need any of that. America has ways, and it's not just a nuclear umbrella. It's the whole panoply of America's political, economic, and defense commitments. But how to go down such a path without sending the wrong signal about deterrence, I think, is one reason it's not on the agenda.
Bob, did you want to add anything to that?
I actually hadn't thought about it, but I have been while Mark was talking. I think if you were negotiating with North Korea, forgive me for constantly coming back to the concept, but the idea that could be part of, just like a treaty of peace might be to replace the armistice, other elements, it might make the medicine go down better. The outcome, if you said it would, what we have as an outcome for North Korea would be part of a nuclear weapons-free zone, then it might be politically useful and desirable. The downside that it might impact, if not our ability to execute our assurance in extended deterrence, perhaps the perception that it would, and therefore the credibility of it would be hampered. However, Mark, we do this with Japan. Right now, we have found out that it was 2.5 and not 3, as you point out as principles. But we've managed with the Japanese to be reassuring. We also have managed, notwithstanding some enthusiasm in South Korea, that we bring nuclear weapons back, not to bring nuclear weapons back. So I think that probably could be done if it would turn out that it would be significant in Pyongyang that their non-nuclear status was encased in a nuclear weapons-free zone. So I guess I'd keep that arrow as a possible one in the quiver.
Okay, let's take a few more. There's 2 right here together.
Oh, hi. My name is Alan Ahn. I'm a Director of Programs and Communications for the Global America Business Institute. We do a number of programs on energy, nuclear power issues. So you, Mr. Fitzpatrick, you suggested that, and let me correct me if I'm wrong. So Taiwan, as you said, moving away from nuclear power. You said that eventually that will remove the latency, and I guess by extension that would reduce the likelihood of Taiwan going nuclear. What do you think about the opposite, I guess, argument or angle on this? That as you increase the reliance on nuclear power, you actually reduce the likelihood of developing nuclear weapons. So out of the 3 countries that you're considering in this case, or at this discussion, Korea arguably the most committed to nuclear power development, 30% of its current electricity generated by nuclear, that's going to likely, probably increase in the upcoming decades. So I mean, one almost certain consequence of going nuclear is to basically lose access to the global civil nuclear supply chain. So basically, you're not going to be able to fuel your reactors anymore, and you've basically lost your civil nuclear capabilities that you've painfully developed over many decades. So I guess I would just pose that question to you, since they seem to be the most committed to nuclear power. The public can say whatever they want. Obviously, they're going to be riled up every time there is a North Korean nuclear test. Obviously, you're going to have these sways in public opinion. Trump is pretty clear evidence of that here. And but I mean, ultimately, the decision makers, the corporations, they're not going to want to lose the lifeblood of their industrial economy.
Okay, good, thank you. And then I think the woman there.
Also, Global America Business Institute. Alan touched up on a little bit of my question that I was going to pose you, or statement. Both of you seem to assume that Korean public is for the developing nuclear weapons. But those are based on the pollings and newspaper articles and public statements. And all those pollings and public statements that were done shortly after the shelling of Yeonpyeong Island or North Korea's missile test. When those things happen right in your backyard, emotions run high. So the pollings should be based on the several different stages. So shortly after 90% initially, it had gone down drastically to 45% a few months later. So it's gradually going down. So I'm not sure if it's fair to assume that the Korean public opinion based on the polling and the statements.
Thank you. All right, let's take one more. This gentleman up in the front here.
I'm Jonathan Pollack from the Brookings Institution. Mark, I'm going to try to flip a lot of your arguments briefly. Bob used the operative word of theology, and so much of these are theological arguments, often defense planning circles and so forth. But if I reflect a bit on the sentiments that have been there periodically, not only in Northeast Asia, but more globally, a lot of it may be impulses towards autonomy and identity that may not really be so directly tied to presumptions of will the United States be there for us under the most extreme of circumstances, because very frankly, except under very binding alliance conditions that say are operative in NATO, how do you prove it? How do you demonstrate it? And so my question really, though, is are you presuming that if there were sentiment that mobilizes in any of these societies, this would be done covertly, as distinct from overtly? My Korean friends are very, very open about it. I mean, if you have leading Korean politicians who advocate it, there's not a lot of obscurity about it. So, what would be the chain of events here, or is it possible to conceptualize this simply as a deeper, almost emotional sentiment, rather than anything based on some kind of rational calculus, or maybe a belief that at the end of the day, countries would prefer to shape their own destiny rather than rely on anyone?
A couple of questions on public opinion and one on the role of power, nuclear power.
So, Ellen, yeah, you put your finger on one of the strong reasons why it would be very much against South Korea's interests, because they rely for 29% of their energy on nuclear power. And they wouldn't be able to operate those plants without the fuel from their foreign suppliers, which would be cut off as a matter of law, not politics, if they were to go down a nuclear path. Not just the United States, every single one of their nuclear, their partners. and so I tried to point that out, and also the export industry. South Korea is trying to build itself as one of the world's leading nuclear energy export. The $40 billion project in the United Arab Emirates, that would go down the drain. So it's a good argument you make. Florence, if I may, the polling, you're right, one can see a trend line down in the polling. It's not just that the polls were taken after a serious North Korean provocation. There have been several polls over the years, and you're right that earlier on there was some that was up to 90%. The most recent that I have seen is still over 50%. I haven't seen one at 45%. Maybe it came out after my book was published. So I would say just that more than half of the South Korean population still answers yes to the question. I think maybe it's a matter of education. Maybe the more they think about the kind of issues that Alan mentioned, that they would realize the demerits. And the demerits are many. And I think the vulnerability demerit is an important one, because they wouldn't be able to do it in secret. In fact, as you say, they don't want to do it in secret. The whole point is to put leverage on the Chinese, to put leverage on the North Koreans, to kind of threaten to go nuclear. When I talk with some South Koreans who advocate going nuclear, they say, no, we don't really want to go nuclear. We just want the Chinese to think that we are, or the North Koreans to think that we are. So they would do it in public. But they couldn't do it in secret anyway, because they're no longer authoritarian states like they were when Park Chung-hee was trying to do it, and he was found out. And the Taiwanese were found out when they were authoritarian state, because the United States had good intelligence assets, and I presume they still do. But in any case, these are open societies, fractious parliaments, and open press. They would have to debate the funding for a program. They couldn't do it in secret without somebody blowing the whistle. But you're right about the emotional. I used the word emotionally when I wrote my notes, but I thought, that's a pejorative word, so I changed it to fairness, psychological. There's a whole mix of reasons, and they're particularly strong in South Korea. And that's why I say that that's the one that is the most likely, if any of the three were to go down that road.
Okay, it is 11 o'clock, so if people need to leave, please feel free to leave. We won't have any demerits against you, but I think there are enough questions here that if our speakers will allow, I'd like to go ahead and take a few more. So please, Maria, right back, the gentleman next to you. Yes.
Hello, I'm Dennis Halpin from the U.S. Korea Institute. I had a question about how North Korea impacts its neighbors in the U.S. in a broader sense, in that it looks like North Korea might have become the new warehouse in replacing AQCON on nuclear technology. I mean, I remember a few years ago meeting an Australian journalist in Thailand when there were concerns about proliferation to the Myanmar, the Burmese junta. There was the Syrian reactor, which Ms. Ross-Layton and my former boss debated with Chris Hill. And then ISIS, of course, occupied the site last year that the Israelis had destroyed. There was the whole AQCON-Pakistan relationship. And there's ongoing concerns that North Korea is sharing technology with Iran and other states. So if North Korea is even a larger threat beyond Northeast Asia, if it does become the new AQCON, how does that impact these three countries and the United States' policy with
Okay, and right across the aisle there, please.
Ken Meyercord, World. And then a question. When we were developing our atomic bomb during the 30s and 40s, was there public discussion? Did Congress authorize the funding for it? It's my understanding that Harry Truman didn't even know we were making the bomb when he was vice president. My question is, I'm the only person I know who doesn't think Israel has nuclear weapons. Whether it does or not, I think is a moot point, because if they do, they wouldn't dare use them without our permission. And if they don't, and we want somebody nuked in the Middle East, we would just give them the weapons. They do have nuclear-capable delivery systems. Can you foresee something like that evolving in East Asia?
Bob, can you take the North Korea question?
I want to. Yes. The second one is distracting me at the moment. But let me go to the first one. One of the things that has struck me as interesting about the North Korean construction of what can only be described or should only be described as a plutonium production reactor, wasn't connected to any electrical grid or anything, is that people in the United States didn't care enough, including those in the administration, and then those in Northeast Asia, as best I could tell, didn't care at all. Now, I understood the second better than the first. In other words, when I was completely distracted by my thing is nuclear terrorism, even more than nuclear proliferation, and the long pole in the tent, as we like to say, to the nuclear terrorist scenario, is acquisition of fissile material. The other stuff, manageable, that's still hard. The nuclear security issues, therefore, is very important. So that those in Northeast Asia, when I would try to, the only way I could get the attention of people in Seoul over how horrendous this event was, the construction of that facility by the North Koreans in Syria, was to tell them that while they worried that in 1994, President Clinton, might have actually struck the facilities at Yangbian had the North Koreans spent fuel from the pond to the reprocessing facility, and the North Koreans would have worried that there was no real consultation over that because enough of us have written about this, and to make it clear that sometimes we have had these thoughts, and the leadership in Seoul want to know, when were you going to tell us that you had these thoughts? Transpose that to this situation, in order to get their attention in part, and also because I believe it, I said I thought an appropriate response to the North Korean construction of the facility in Syria would have been a kinetic response, to use the current term. In other words, it seems to me that was sufficient provocation and a threat to the countries all over the world, but particularly to the United States, of the production of plutonium in a place that used to be a country, Syria. So this was very bad. People in Northeast Asia, I don't think, to answer part of your question, understood this was particularly bad, except that were we to have struck, if they believed me or others that this was serious enough that we might have actually done something to North Korea in response, that they would have cared about. The construction of a facility halfway around the world, not so much. My perspective here, just if I could just go on just a little bit longer here, is that this has never produced the kind of démarche in Pyongyang that it should have. Chris Hill did raise this with the North Koreans. That, to me, is not quite enough. This is not a cut at Chris by any means. It's just that this is a non-repeatable offense from my perspective for us, and for the North Koreans, it was pretty good. I mean, as best I can tell, they got paid. They don't really care that the facility was squashed by the Israeli version of non-proliferation. And what's not to repeat here? That's the wrong lesson, in my view, for North Korea to take away from this. That they will do more than Myanmar here in terms of what they will sell elsewhere, I really don't know. I don't have a notebook filled with North Korea transfers. But that this one went down in the way it did bothers me. And as we look around the world, there are a few places where you can imagine transfer. Leakage, more, right? It could leak out of Russia, but we're not thinking Putin is going to transfer this material to a terrorist group or to an iffy state. But and Pakistan may have learned its lesson at this point. I actually don't know. But certainly there's no reason to believe North Korea has.
Okay, Mark, I'm going to give you the last word, but I'm going to exercise my prerogative as chair to also ask you a question. You talked a little bit about this, but I'm going to ask you to expand on it a little bit. So, looking forward, the new president takes office. They pick up the phone, call you on their first day, say, Mark, what do I need to do to reassure our allies in Asia? What kinds of things would you like to see them continue that we're already doing, or do new initiatives that you'd like to see?
Okay, thanks very much, Jennifer. And then the question posed about what's the possibility of a Manhattan Project style all efforts and total secrecy to go nuclear the way the United States did. And this is really a central theme in my book is under what circumstances might these countries do it. I think it would probably take circumstances like an all-out war in which all the energies and resources of the nation were applied and where there was a shared national vision on the need to do it quickly and in secret, and then how fast could they get there. So that war scenario brings us into a lot of uncharted territory and raises a lot of other issues. So the development of a nuclear weapon during a war that would still take at a minimum 6 months, because you actually have to build a reprocessing plant, you have to reprocess the plutonium, or you have to enrich the uranium. So it does take a little bit of time. And today's wars, a major war of that magnitude, probably be over before 6 months. So what would boy, that'd be great if they call me. I'll have to get my answer down a little bit more pat. I think it's very important to retain the very good advances that have been made in the last years. And it wasn't just the Obama administration that did the pivot to Asia. It was a rebalancing under George W. Bush, who used another term. And I think it's very important to continue to show that in manifest ways, continuing the deterrence consultations that have been in place, but also maintaining a very strict line on no reprocessing expansion of capabilities. Try to encourage countries not to go down enrichment. In fact, I would argue for a ban on HEU production through the Nuclear Security Summit or other ways to diminish the normalcy of having a fissile material that could be put to weapons use in a circumstance.
Okay. Thank you all for coming today. We really appreciate it. Please join me in thanking you.
It's fun. It's great.
I got to write down your 14 points. You only got to 7, though.
How are you? Good to see you.